I never thought feeding birds would cost me everything I loved about my home. But at 78 years old, I learned that some battles are worth fighting, no matter how impossible they seem. My name is Harold Pemberton, and for the past 12 years, I've called Willowbrook Commons home. When Margaret and I first moved here, we were drawn to the quiet streets, well-maintained houses, and especially the beautiful little community park that sat right in the center of our neighborhood. Margaret had always loved birds. She could identify species by their songs alone and kept detailed journals of migration patterns. After 43 years of marriage, her enthusiasm had become infectious. Every morning at 7:30 sharp, I'd make my way to our little community park with a paper bag of bird seed. It wasn't much, just a quiet ritual that brought me peace after losing Margaret 3 years ago. The cardinals reminded me of her favorite lipstick shade, and the blue jays had her stubborn personality. She would have loved seeing how the sparrows had multiplied over the years, raising generation after generation in the oak trees that bordered the walking path. The routine had become sacred to me. Wake up at 6:30, make coffee in the same mug Margaret had given me for our 20th anniversary, fill a small paper bag with the mixed birdseed I bought in bulk from the farm supply store, and walk the 150 yards to the park. The birds knew my schedule, as well as I did. By the time I reached my favorite bench, the one facing east so I could watch the sunrise while they fed, cardinals would already be gathering in the nearby bushes waiting for their breakfast. That Tuesday morning in October started like any other. The air was crisp with the first hint of winter, and the maple leaves were just beginning to turn the brilliant red that Margaret had always said looked like nature's way of celebrating. I was sitting on my usual bench, watching a family of sparrows compete for sunflower seeds, when I saw Brenda Castellanos marching toward me with her clipboard and that expression that meant someone was about to have their day ruined. Brenda had been our HOA president for 3 years, ever since she'd moved to Willowbrook Commons from some upscale development across town. She approached every aspect of community management like a military campaign, complete with strategic planning sessions and enforcement protocols that she'd email to residents in lengthy, passive-aggressive newsletters. As far as I could tell, she viewed any form of spontaneous joy as a personal challenge to her authority. She handed me the citation without any preamble, her perfectly manicured fingernails clicking against the clipboard as she pointed to a "No Feeding Wildlife" sign that had appeared overnight just 20 feet from my bench. A sign that definitely hadn't been there the week before. The metal post was still shiny, and I could see where the dirt had been recently disturbed around its base. The timing was no coincidence. The paper trembled in my hands as I read the bureaucratic language that felt designed to humiliate rather than inform. The citation referenced city ordinance numbers I'd never heard of and HOA covenant violations that seemed to have been written specifically for this moment. I was being fined $150, 0 cents, for creating unsanitary conditions through unauthorized wildlife feeding and attracting nuisance animals to common areas. The language was cold and clinical, describing my daily ritual with Margaret's memory as if it were some kind of public health hazard. But the real punch to the gut was the additional notice attached to the back of the citation. Any further violations would result in a $500 0 cents fine and potential legal action for persistent disregard of community standards. They were essentially threatening to take me to court if I continued feeding the birds that had been part of my morning routine for over a decade. I tried to explain that I'd been feeding birds here for 12 years, long before most of the current residents had moved in. I told Brenda about Margaret, about how this simple act connected me to the woman I'd shared my life with for 4 decades. She cut me off mid-sentence, informing me that the HOA had evolved and that my activities were no longer acceptable in a community that maintained high property values. She actually used the word activities like I was running some kind of legal operation instead of scattering birdseed for 20 minutes each morning. Before I could respond, she was already walking away, her heels clicking on the concrete path as she headed toward her next target. I sat there alone on the bench, holding a piece of paper that had just criminalized the one thing that brought me comfort in the 3 years since Margaret's death. That night, I sat in my empty house and stared at the citation until the words blurred together. The house felt especially quiet without even the anticipation of my morning routine. I could pay the fine, stop feeding the birds, and let Brenda win. It would be the easy path, the one that most people my age would choose, but sitting there in the living room where Margaret and I had planned our retirement, where we talked about growing old together and watching the seasons change through our front window, I realized I had a choice to make. Margaret always said I was too stubborn for my own good, and this felt like the kind of fight she would have wanted me to take on. She'd spent her career as a school librarian standing up to administrators who wanted to ban books, parents who complained about diverse authors, and budget committees who saw libraries as unnecessary expenses. If she could fight for what mattered to her, I could do the same. The next morning, I didn't go to the park. Instead, I drove to the county courthouse and spent the day in the records office, learning about property ownership and HOA regulations. The clerk, a patient woman named Rosa, who reminded me of my daughter, helped me navigate the filing system and explained how to request copies of deeds, surveys, and development agreements. What I discovered over the following weeks would change everything. But first, I had to endure the hardest part of this whole ordeal. Without my morning routine, my days felt shapeless and empty. I'd wake up at 6:30 out of habit, make coffee in Margaret's mug, and then have nowhere to go. The birdseed sat unopened in my kitchen cabinet, a constant reminder of what I'd lost. I started taking different walking routes around the neighborhood, partly to avoid the park and partly because I was beginning to pay attention to property boundaries in a way I never had before. I noticed survey markers, utility easements, and the subtle differences between HOA maintained areas and city-owned land. The more I observed, the more questions I had about who actually owned what in our carefully planned community. 2 weeks after the citation, Brenda sent out one of her infamous community-wide emails. This one was particularly vindictive, using my situation as an example of her successful enforcement action against residents who showed flagrant disregard for community standards. She actually praised herself for taking swift action against rule violations and warned other residents that she would continue to maintain the high standards that protected our property values. Reading that email, seeing my private struggle turned into her public victory, made me angrier than I'd been since the day Margaret died, but this anger was different. It was focused and purposeful in a way that surprised me. I printed out the email and added it to the growing file folder I'd started keeping on my kitchen table, right next to the property records and HOA documents I'd been collecting. The breakthrough came on a cold December morning when I finally located the original development plans for Willowbrook Commons from 1985. I'd driven to the city planning office for the third time, armed with specific parcel numbers and legal descriptions that I'd pieced together from various documents. The plans revealed something that made my heart race with possibility. Willowbrook Commons had been built by Meridian Development Company, but the parkland had been designated as a separate parcel from the beginning. The HOA had been granted a lease agreement for $1.00 per year to maintain and operate the park for community use, but they had never actually owned the land. It was a subtle but crucial distinction that changed everything. When Meridian went bankrupt in 1993, all their assets had been sold to pay creditors. The residential lots had been sold to individual homeowners, but the parkland had been packaged with other commercial properties and sold to an investment company. Following that paper trail led me through a series of corporate acquisitions and mergers that would have been impossible to trace without the patient help of several courthouse clerks who seemed to enjoy the puzzle as much as I did. The current owner turned out to be a holding company called Southwest Property Holdings, based in Phoenix. They had acquired the park land as part of a bulk purchase of distressed properties in the late 1990s and had apparently forgotten they owned it. To them, it was just an undeveloped lot that generated no income and cost them money in property taxes every year. I spent a week rehearsing what I would say before I finally called them. The property manager, a harried-sounding man named Rick, had to put me on hold for 15 minutes while he looked up their holdings in Arizona. When he came back on the line, he sounded genuinely confused about why anyone would want to buy a small park in a residential community. The asking price was $127,000. 0 cents, a fraction of what the land was actually worth, but fair for what they considered an unwanted asset. Rick was so relieved to get it off their books that we had a purchase agreement signed within the week. I used most of the money Margaret and I had saved for the European trip we had planned to take for our 50th anniversary, the one that cancer had made impossible. The paperwork took 6 weeks to process, during which time I had to maintain complete secrecy about what I was planning. Every morning I'd see other residents walking through the park, taking for granted their access to the space that would soon be mine. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had tried to ban me from feeding birds would soon discover that she had no authority over the park at all. The surveyor flags appeared on a Monday morning in late January. Bright orange markers on thin metal posts scattered across the park according to the professional boundary survey I'd commissioned. I watched from my living room window as neighbors stopped to stare at them, clearly puzzled but not yet alarmed. Some pulled at the flags, trying to read the small tags that identified the surveying company. Brenda walked through the park twice that week, her agitation visible from my front window. She pulled at several flags and appeared to be taking photographs, probably preparing some kind of enforcement action against whoever had dared to place markers on her property. If she had bothered to contact the surveying company, she would have learned that the work was being done on behalf of the park's new owner. But Brenda's approach to problem solving had always been confrontation first, investigation never. The registered letters went out on a Friday in February. Every homeowner in Willowbrook Commons received formal notification that the community park had been sold to a private owner and would be operating under new management effective immediately. I had my attorney, James Peterson, craft the language carefully, professional, and legally precise, but mysterious enough to create maximum impact. My phone started ringing that evening and didn't stop until I finally turned off the ringer around 10 o'clock. Neighbors wanted to know if I knew anything about the sale, whether I'd received the same letter, what this meant for our property values. I played dumb, expressing the same confusion and concern that everyone else seemed to be feeling. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. I arrived early and took a seat in the back row, carrying the same leather briefcase I'd used throughout my 40-year career as an accountant. The room filled quickly with confused and angry residents, their voices creating a buzz of anxiety that I found oddly satisfying. Brenda called the meeting to order with her usual theatrical authority, but I could see the cracks in her composure. She launched into a furious speech about unauthorized sales, legal challenges, and her determination to fight whoever had stolen community property. She promised to hire attorneys, file injunctions, and do whatever it took to reverse this illegal transaction. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had spent months lecturing about following rules and maintaining standards had never bothered to verify that the HOA actually owned the land she was so proudly protecting. Her assumption of ownership had been so complete that she'd never questioned the legal basis for her authority. I waited until she finished her rant before standing up. The room fell silent as I walked to the front, my footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. I opened my briefcase deliberately, spreading out the documents that would change everything, and finally spoke for the first time since receiving that citation 4 months earlier. When I announced that I was the new owner of the park, the silence was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that room full of 43 homeowners who had just realized that their most annoying neighbor had somehow become their landlord. The look on Brenda's face was worth every hour I'd spent in dusty record rooms and every dollar I'd paid in legal fees. I explained the situation methodically, using the same calm, factual tone I'd developed during 4 decades of explaining complex financial reports to executives who thought they knew more than they did. The park had never belonged to the HOA. For nearly 30 years, they had been operating under a $1.00 per year lease that had automatically terminated when the original property owner, went bankrupt in 1993. Since then, they had been maintaining and making rules for land they had no legal right to control. Every citation they'd issued, every rule they'd enforced, every meeting they'd held to discuss park policy had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of property ownership that no one had ever bothered to verify. But I wasn't finished. I announced that effective immediately, the park would be renamed Pemberton Wildlife Sanctuary in honor of my late wife Margaret, who had spent her life teaching children to appreciate the natural world. Wildlife feeding was not only permitted, but actively encouraged. I had already ordered professional bird feeders, native flowering plants, and educational signage about local bird species and proper feeding practices. The park would remain open to community members, but now they would be my guests rather than fellow owners. I had established a rental fee of $200 0 cents per day for private events like birthday parties or community gatherings, payable directly to me. More importantly, since the park was no longer a part of the HOA's common areas, they could no longer cite residents for activities that took place on my property. Ever been in a situation where you felt completely powerless, only to discover you had more options than you realized? That's exactly what this moment felt like. 4 months of grief and anger transforming into something that felt like justice. Brenda tried to salvage some authority, demanding to see permits and threatening to challenge the sale in court. I was ready for this too. From my briefcase, I pulled out a thick folder containing every document, permit, and legal filing related to the purchase. The land survey was professionally completed, the title was clear and insured, and every county requirement had been satisfied. When she threatened to ban HOA members from using the park, I calmly explained that my attorney had negotiated a permanent community access easement as part of the purchase agreement. Residents could continue to use the park, but they would be doing so as guests on my private property, subject to my rules rather than the HOA's arbitrary regulation. The most satisfying moment came when someone in the crowd asked about the original citation that had started this whole conflict. I reached into my briefcase one more time and pulled out the crumpled paper that had threatened me with fines and legal action for feeding birds. I held it up for everyone to see, then very deliberately tore it in half. This citation, I announced, was issued by an organization that had no legal authority over the property in question. As the rightful owner of this land, I hereby declare that all previous citations related to wildlife feeding activities are null and void. The meeting ended with Brenda storming out, followed by two board members who seemed to suddenly realize their potential legal exposure in this situation. Most of the other residents stayed to ask questions, and several actually thanked me for what I'd done. A few admitted they'd always thought the HOA's rules were too restrictive, but had been afraid to speak up. Over the following months, I transformed the park into something Margaret would have loved. I hired a landscaping company to install professional bird feeders at strategic locations throughout the space. Native plants were added to provide natural food sources and create a more diverse ecosystem that would attract different species throughout the year. New benches were positioned for optimal bird watching, and I installed a small solar-powered fountain that attracted even more wildlife. The educational signage included information about proper feeding practices, seasonal migration patterns, and how to identify common species by sight and sound. I even included a small plaque dedicating the sanctuary to Margaret's memory and her lifelong love of birds. Every morning at 7:30, I resumed my ritual of feeding the birds. But now, instead of being alone with my grief and memories, I was often joined by neighbors who had discovered the joy of watching cardinals, blue jays, and sparrows go about their daily lives. Children would stop by after school to learn about different bird species, and several residents started bringing their own carefully selected seeds and nuts. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was social and emotional as well. The park became a gathering place in a way it had never been before. People would sit on the benches and actually talk to each other instead of hurrying past with their heads down. Dog walkers would pause to watch the bird feeders, and joggers would slow down to appreciate the fountain and flowering plants. The best part was watching Brenda drive past the park each morning, Seeing her face as she observed the thriving wildlife sanctuary that had replaced her sterile, rule-bound common area. The space was more beautiful and more actively used than it had ever been under HOA management. Property values in the neighborhood actually increased, partly because of the unique amenity that no other development could offer. Brenda submitted her resignation as HOA president 6 months later, citing irreconcilable differences with community direction. Her replacement was a retired teacher named Patricia, who had been feeding birds in her own backyard for years and appreciated what I'd created. The new board's first official act was to pass a resolution thanking me for my generous stewardship of community green space. The financial aspects worked out better than I'd expected. The park rental fees covered my property taxes and maintenance costs, with enough left over to fund improvements and expansions. I used the surplus to install security cameras and lighting, making the space safer for evening use. I also started a small endowment fund to ensure the sanctuary would continue operating even after I'm gone. But the real reward wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that I'd turned a moment of defeat into something lasting and meaningful. The citation that was supposed to shame me into compliance had actually revealed an opportunity that no one else had recognized. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about creating something better than what existed before. I don't know if I handled everything perfectly, but it worked. At 78, I learned that age doesn't have to mean powerlessness, and that sometimes the most effective response to bureaucratic bullying is patient, methodical research followed by decisive action. The park is now a place where feeding birds is celebrated rather than criminalized, where community members gather to appreciate nature rather than enforce arbitrary rules. When people ask me why I went to such lengths over a simple bird feeding citation, I tell them it was never really about the birds. It was about refusing to let someone else's narrow vision diminish the small joys that make life worth living. It was about honoring Margaret's memory and the values she'd taught me about standing up for what matters. Margaret would have been proud of that fight, and every morning when I sit on my bench, surrounded by the birds we both loved, I know she's there with me, enjoying the view. The citation that was supposed to end my bird feeding days ultimately gave me permanent ownership of the very land where those birds had always belonged. Honestly, I'd love to know how you'd handle something like this. Would you have paid the fine and walked away? Or would you have fought back? Sometimes the most impossible situations turn out to have solutions we never imagined, and the key is being willing to do the work to find them. The Margaret Pemberton Wildlife Sanctuary will continue operating long after I'm gone, a permanent reminder that sometimes the best victories are the ones that transform punishment into paradise.